Good. Thank you very much, Del. So we should get right on. We've got, as Del said, we've got 20 minutes presentation and 10 minutes for questions. And the first speaker on my list is Chris Hemmings. So, got Chris there? There you are. Good,
I'm here.
Good. Would you like to kick off and tell us what you're going to talk about?
Yeah, I'll briefly introduce myself. I'm a former journalist, an author of a book about macho culture, and I now work in schools and businesses and some universities. I developed this program called Empath Training, M-Path. It's a cheesy play on words, which is my favorite thing. And it's about trying to promote a healthier version of masculinity. I'm also currently, I've just started a master's in counseling and psychotherapy. So I will start by saying that I am not speaking about this stuff at all as an expert in the therapy space. But what I have been doing for the past 6 years is traveling the country and speaking to men. And I've been speaking to men and finding out a lot of really interesting stuff. And I know it's an anathema to the therapy space for the therapist to self-disclose, but I often start my talks by explaining how I came to do this work, because I think it then makes sense as to why I'm here. And so I, at the age of 19, 20, was the social secretary of the rugby union society at university. And to wanted to put it a better way, I was a bit of an arsehole. I actually was engaging in behaviors that were damaging to other people. What I came to realize many years later was that I was engaging in behaviors that were damaging myself. And that happened when I was 25 and my father died, and I ended up 3 months later at the barrel of alcohol and cocaine, en route to an addiction. And it was at that point that I started to look around and have conversations with men, and was kind of confused by a lot of the language that was happening in this sphere, and also confused by the fact that the vast majority of people trying to work to prevent male violence or even male suicide were women. And a lot of the work, it seemed to be a woman's issue. A lot of this work seemed to be a woman's issue, and there weren't that many men at the time working. I know that there are increasingly now, and that's good. I'm an example of that. But what I came to start to focus on a lot was this idea of empathy, and learning about the fact that we know that at kind of early years, boys and girls have very similar levels of empathy, but by the time we get into kind of teenage years, girls start to develop a greater sense of empathy with each other. And where that might have come from and why that's developed, because, I also found out nearly 10 years ago, the suicide statistic about men being under 45, and, learning that nearly 4,000 men take their own life every year. And so I started to go out and do this work, and I started to go and do talks. And I think what is interesting from what has been said already today is that I have to be very honest that when I first started doing this work, I was getting it completely wrong. I was going to audiences and I was trying to out-intellectualize the men in the audience to try to get them on board with my argument. And I realized quite quickly that that simply was not working. So I went back to the drawing board and had to try to find a new path. Because what I realized is that using terms like feminism, even using terms like intersectionality, using those academic phrases for the sort of men that I want to engage in this work, it is an immediate switch off. They turn off immediately when that sort of language is used. And instead, I now use this. I spoke to a guy in Australia called Zach Seidler, who's a therapist in Australia, and he told me about this kind of Trojan horse, the Trojan horse method of working with men in particular, of meeting them where they are. So there is a problem with engaging men in this sort of discourse, just as I'm aware that there's a problem engaging certain sorts of men in therapy. Obviously, we know that far fewer men go to therapy, and there are actually fewer male therapists, and that, you know, men often turn up to therapy at a point of crisis. And so how do we get them into that space in the first place? But it's the same with me, with my work in a school. How do I get these men to engage with me when I've got a day with them? And I have to do that, and I don't usually speak in absolutes, but I have to do that by meeting them where they are. And that means I engage in gender stereotyping. I gender stereotype myself. I talk about some of my own stuff, and I play into the narratives that they are playing into themselves. You know, I mock myself, and I also big myself up, so to speak, in the way that teenage boys would do, in the way that kind of 20-something-year-old men would do. And in doing so, that drops their guard. And once their guard is down, then we can start to have the difficult conversations with them. And the conversations, and the reality is that the men that are out in the world right now, a lot of the men who are really struggling, the men who are not, let's say, moving with the times, who are still stuck in rigid gender stereotypes that I personally think are damaging in many ways. But by talking to them and saying that, you know, let's talk about this phrase toxic masculinity, which somebody mentioned before. But masculinity is not in and of itself toxic, but there are aspects, potentially there are aspects of it that might be damaging you. So let's maybe talk about those things, but let's not demonize. Because as soon as we start to demonize, the men switch off. The second that the men feel threatened and confronted, because many men have fragile egos, we lose them from the debate immediately. And I've seen it happen because I've made that mistake myself. And so there has to, look, I am starting out on this journey. My plan is to open a male-centric therapy practice. And so today's conference is going to be fascinating for me to learn from you all. But from my field research of speaking to men constantly, this is what turns them off. They are tired of being demonized. They are tired of being told that they are wrong, that they are bad, that they are all to blame. And instead, it's about how we bring them all on board into the conversation, because you can sit with a man in a therapy space, or I can sit with a young boy doing some counseling work in a school, or having these talks and workshops that I run, and I can get them fully on board for 50 minutes, and they agree with everything that we're talking about, and they are engaged. But as soon as they walk out of that space, they are back into the bear pit. And once they're back into that bear pit, it is the most difficult thing in the world for them to take that learning into their real life, into the real world. And it's about how we start as a society to free men, because masculinity is not a singularity. We talk about masculinity as this single thing. Masculinity is not a singularity. It is a complete spectrum. And so my most important message to the boys in the room is, however many of you in here consider yourself to be masculine, there are that many ways that masculinity is acceptable to be. But that's not the message that is given to these boys. It's that masculinity is toxic. Well, it's not. Some aspects of masculinity are absolutely wonderful and fantastic, and we don't celebrate those things. Society does not celebrate those things. Instead, it's so often demeaning language to young boys. But also, I had the absolute pleasure recently of speaking to a guy called Ronald Levant, who used to run the American Psychological Association. And he told me about his work, and it's my new favorite concept that I'm really thinking about with the boys that I know and the men that I know, my friends, around normative male alexithymia. So this idea that a lot of men literally don't have the vocabulary or ability to talk about the emotions that they have. And so we want to increase empathy in young men, But empathy is about knowing and understanding and sharing other people's feelings. So how is that possible if they can't even identify their own? And so again, it's about freeing ourselves from this box that we are put in as men, and that we feel this, that we have to strictly adhere to. And that's what I did for 10 years. From the age of 15 to 25, I performed a version of myself that was completely at odds with who I was. Now, I'm very, very fortunate that I had my realization at 25 years old, and I've been working. I'm 34 and I've been working ever since to try and free myself from that. But as I'm in therapy and as I'm doing this work and as I'm researching more, I realize how pervasive it has been in the darkest depths of my brain. So many things. I realize, wow, what I'm doing there is hyper macho, because 10 years is a long time. And if you're working with men who are 40, 50 years old, who are still stuck in that rigidity, to try to get them to break free from it and to see it is so difficult. And it's not going to be a case of, here's another concept. Surely you know what you're doing is damaging. Surely surely you should be, you should be doing better. It's going to take a long, long time for societal norms to shift. And for me, we have to break it down into its tiniest fractions. I say to the men in the room and the boys in the room that I work with, I'm not expecting us here to save the world. It's about changing it. Every single tiny little intervention, every time we do something slightly different, or we at least think about why we're behaving in that way, we are changing the world forever in that moment, in ways that my granddad was made of stone and my dad tried his best, but I saw my granddad in my dad. And so I have my dad in me, and it's about every generation moving forward and moving away from that. And to accept, the gender genie is out of the bottle. You can't put it back in. The masculinity genie, this healthy masculinity genie, is out of the bottle. You can't put it back in. That's not how it works. So we have to start working within the framework of what's in front of us. And what is in front of us right now are a lot of confused, scared men. Confused by who they're meant to be, and scared of what's going to happen to them when they slip up. Scared of what's going to happen to them when they, when they are put in a position where they're not able to deal emotionally with the situation. And they are scared. But it's to let these men know that they're not to blame for their thoughts. They're not to blame for their beliefs, that their thoughts and their belief patterns they have been passed down. They're generational. And we're only now trying to unpick them. Within the last 10 years, there's been a proper movement to actually try to free men from the constraints. This is not, it's in its infancy as far as I'm concerned. We have so much further to go, because 3 weeks ago, we put one of my mates in the ground. He took his own life. And so often when you hear this narrative around male suicide, and I'm so tired of hearing it, that it came out of the blue. It never comes out of the blue. But we as men are incredible at hiding it all. And we as men are dreadful at seeing it. And we as a society are bad at seeing it in men. And there is still an expectation that men have to front up. I went through something extremely traumatic recently, and when I explained that I was I was briefly suicidal, two women in my life, one saying that I was being pathetic, and another saying that my trauma is not as important as the trauma that women experience every day. And this is a societal thing that we experience, that the patriarchal norms that women buy into too, but men also, is that we're not allowed to express and feel. So how do we create that space? What do we do? I often talk in businesses. I say, okay, anybody in the audience now, tell me some of the societies you're a part of. And there's LGBT, there's black or an ethnicity one. There's one on gender. There's one on all of these different things. And then I say, is there a men's group? Is there a men's group in this business? And so often I hear the scoff from the audience. Why does there need to be a men's group? The whole of the world is a men's group. And you say,
you've got
well,
4 minutes, just
okay,
letting you know.
Thank you. And it's like, well, the whole world is built on patriarchal norms, yes. But why is everybody so scared of men trying to create healthier spaces? But the problem then is that when I ask the men and try to empower the men to do that, they don't want to do the work. They love the idea of having that space, but we don't want to do the work for ourselves. And it's very difficult. And this is the gap that needs to be plugged. This is where the empathy needs to come in, because we're not taking time as men to look at each other in the eye and say, what's going on? To empower each other to be vulnerable. Society does not empower men to be vulnerable. It does not empower us to put our arm around our friend. And the therapy space, from the research that I'm doing, is not something that men want to go into. They don't like it. It's confrontational. They don't know what it is. There was some great research at Birkbeck University. I did a documentary on it for the BBC about why so few male students go to counselling in university spaces. And they completely redesigned it. They showed the men videos of what it was like in there, dispelling the myths of what it's like in there. They advertised in specific ways. We have to meet men where they are right now. And where they are right now is confused and scared. And rather than belittling, and rather than using that phraseology and terminology of intellectualizing it all, we have to meet them where they are. And if we don't meet them where they are, they're not going to come with us on the journey. And where they are is dark. A lot of men right now, and I know that from speaking to boys. They are dark. But the beautiful thing is that there are so many who want to change. They want to be more empathic. They want to be more caring and compassionate. They just don't know how.
You've got 2 minutes.
Okay. They just don't know how to do it. And so I'm so excited to hear from you all today. I'm going to listen all day. This is fast. I'm so honored to be invited here. But I am talking not academically. I'm talking just from my own field research of just going and speaking to men all over the country. It's all I ever talk about. Ask my partner, she's bored of it. That's all I ever talk about. Because I am so determined to help, because I know what it's like. I've been there. I've been stuck in this macho morass, and it's horrible. And I'm very fortunate that my brain allowed me to break free from it. But a lot of men are not there, and they won't be there until we start showing them some kindness and empathy and saying to them, yes, it's okay that you have anger and violence. It's understandable that you have homophobic tendencies given your upbringing. It's understandable that you are unable to talk about your emotions. Like, let's just show you some compassion and empathy, but say, but here are some alternatives. And what would it be like for you? That's my last question. I always say to the pupils, what would it be like if we showed each other some more empathy? And they always say the school would be a kinder place, a better place, a healthier place, a safer place to be. And we have to create safe places for men. We have to create safe places for men to come where they feel comfortable. And that sometimes means not the traditional way, the traditional interventions, finding new ways.
Can we bring that to an end? Yeah. Great.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that first presentation. I think you raised lots of very important questions. I think just perfect, really, for some of the things that we might be able to talk about. So we've got about 10 minutes. Anyone have any comments, questions that they would like to make?
Chris, thank you for that inspiring talk. I'm no spring chicken, but I count myself among those confused men. Could you help me understand what you mean by masculinity? What is this thing called masculinity?
Yeah. This is my, I have a simple answer to that, is that masculinity is whatever you want it to be. Masculinity for the individual man is whatever they want it to be. It doesn't need to be defined. Why do we have to define what it means to be a man? It doesn't, I don't think it serves anybody, because as soon as you put constraints on the concept of what masculinity is, then anybody who falls outside of that is going to start struggling and wondering whether or not they are enough. So I have my own version of masculinity. You have your own version of masculinity. Both are equally valid.
So what is your version of masculinity? How do you define it?
Mine, as I say, I choose not, I actively choose not to define it, because it changes every single day. You know, I go and hang out in the pub with my mates and watch a football match, and I can be loud and a bit boorish and whatever, but I can also go into schools and do counseling work, and I can sit and be calm and tender but I'm no less of a man in either of the, or more of a man in either of those states. But I also have some, what you would call traditional feminine attributes too, but we all do. And so that's why I choose not to define. I am just a man, and my version of being a man is acceptable, as is yours, as is everybody else's. So I don't know if that's what you wanted to hear, but I actively choose not to define it.
Who have we got first? I thought I saw Diana's hand. Is that right? Yes?
Yes, I just had a quick question in terms of, you say you don't want to define your own masculinity, which I understand. Thank you, by the way, for the presentation. I found myself laughing, being sad, but also from my perspective, like what Del said, how can you define masculinity or not define it if you don't think of femininity? And how I define my own femininity is that I like to go out, say, with a man out there, and I'm only interested in one thing.
Okay.
So if when you say you don't know how to define your masculinity, it means that, how do I know, say somebody like yourself or somebody else, that I want to say, me as a woman, I will feel a woman when I go out with somebody like that?
But
Do you see? So
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying.
yeah.
Words become weaponized because you
Yes,
can't even
exactly.
say these words. You talk
Yes.
about the genie.
Yes, I completely agree. The words become weaponized,
Mhm.
and that's why I choose to put the weapon down.
Yeah.
Because how you feel when you are with me is nothing to do with how masculine it's to do with who I am as a person. And yes, there are some wonderful things about being a man, and I'm not being disparaging about being male. I love male camaraderie. I love the fact, look, I'm 6'3" and big. I love the fact that I make my partner feel safe. I love that. That's amazing. But she makes me feel held in completely different, incredible ways too. And so, like, it's not a contest, but unfortunately, the masculine feminine does become a contest. And that's how it ends up being weaponized. And that's why I choose to put the weapon down and say, no, I don't want to, I don't see any value in defining my masculinity. I'll tell you about myself. I'll happily talk about myself literally all day, but I reject the notion of defining it because I don't think it's valuable. But, and that's the thing for men, is you can talk about, I talk about aspects of masculinity. The good, some bad, the toxic ones, the brilliant ones, the ones that are archaic, the ones that are being developed now, like all these different aspects of masculinity. But you can, you pick and choose which ones you are. You are a variety of them, and so there is no one. There's an infinite number.
And I say that I like your the move of not wanting to put masculinity and I suppose men in a box, I think is partly what it is that you might be saying. But it'd be good maybe at some point to speak about the Trojan horse idea. And I mean, I'm absolutely on board with the idea, if that's the right phrase, the idea that you must meet people where they are. Yeah. Absolutely. But there is something about the Trojan horse. Maybe it's because I think of it as there is something a bit devious with that sort of idea. But maybe that's just my hearing things. But you don't need to respond right away. I think John, you had your hand up at one point.
Yes, thank you, Chris. So just building on what you said about counselling services, I used to be head of a counselling service at the university, and I was very keen on talking to the men in the audience about why do men not come? Why are there so many fewer than women? And I asked it, and some of them say, well, it's considered sort of feminine, it's emotional. But then I asked the women in the audience, and this was interesting, what would your attitude be if you knew that a fellow student or your boyfriend is coming to counselling, expecting them all to say, we'd be loved that he's so in touch with his emotions and so on. And there were a significant number who wouldn't like it. So I'm very interested in this conference being a mixture of men and women. Because what do women think about men being emotional? Is it really? I mean, it wasn't that all the women in the audience thought, no, I would be uncomfortable with him going, but a significant number were.
Yeah, and look, I have never nor will never speak on behalf of women. But what I will say is that I alluded to the fact that when I was in a dark place recently, a now former female friend told me that I was being pathetic when I told her that I had suicidal thoughts. But my response now is that while I don't want that person in my life anymore, she's also a product of, and this is a filthy word to use around boys, the patriarchal structures. Now, internalized misogyny is a real thing. So, women also take on that mentality towards men, that because we as the patriarchal structures have told women that men are the protectors, the providers, the strong, tough one, and that anything other than that means that it means that you're somehow lesser of a man, and that all continues to perpetuate that notion. So it's a whole societal problem that we have. It's not just, when I go to audiences, I often say, like, women, like, thank you for all of the emotional labor you've been doing for men forever, but lads, can we now do this for ourselves for a while? Now I realize that women aren't going to stop doing it, but it's about trying to get men to break that down, because we're the ones that, let's be honest, we still run this world. So we have the power to make change, but the men don't, but the powerful men don't want to make change. They're not invested in real change, because the real change doesn't suit them. The old systems and the old structures are what suits the archaic power people who are in power, and so it's going to be really difficult to do. And I appreciate that. I don't think I'm going to be out of a job anytime soon. I don't think anybody here is going to be out of a job anytime soon. But it's how we get in society to normalize just the basic understanding that we all have mental health. But the problem is that all we ever hear about male mental health in the media, and I have to hold my hands up as being a part of the media for a long time and exacerbating it, is men need to talk more, men need to talk more, men need to talk more. Well, all men ever do is talk. But what are we talking about? When are we talking about it? Where are we talking about it? And how? Those are the conversations that we don't have.
I think that there are so many sort of important issues that have been spoken about here. I think that there are questions out there about the patriarchy and internalized misogyny. I think that these are very difficult things, because I think there is a point to saying them. But I think part of what you might be saying, Chris, or some of what seems to be coming out, is let's say, go back to the notion of the box. it's not simply that men put men in the box. I think there's a question about whether or not, you know, you get put in the box as a man or as a woman in some ways. And maybe both men and women are quite active in keeping people in the boxes where they are. I mean, but I guess that's a very controversial thing to say. But,
well, I'm not sure it is, because I read some research that showed that about 18 months, mums start to police the emotional responses of young boys along gender lines. But why does the mum do that? Because the mum is the product of a system that has created that mentality towards boys. So again, it's not her fault. It's a constant. It's a constant, and breaking it down is going to be really tough.